Good afternoon. This afternoon, we were interviewing William D. Machen. Is that pronounced correctly?
Machen if you're German, Machen if you're
Machen?
English.
Okay, Machen and Machen. All right. Who lives in Troy, Ohio at the present time, and he was born on October the 12th, 1946. He served the United States Air Force as an enlisted man, achieved the rank of Sergeant E4. He served from 1970 to 1974. He served during this conflict of Vietnam, but he spent 2 years in the United States and 2 years in Wiesbaden, Germany. He received 2 medals, the NORAD Defense Service Medal and the Air Force General Command Medal. His duties in service was as a medic, and he has some interesting stories to talk about that. This interview is being done on April the 30th, 2013 in Troy, Ohio at the American Legion Post 43 in conjunction with the Library of Congress Veterans History Project and the Miami County Veterans History Project. My name is Robert J. Shook, assisted by Paul Holt, by Jay Wackler, and Jeff Gerlach, who belong to the Miami County Veterans History Project Committee. This interview is being conducted at American Legion Post 43 in Troy, Ohio. It was the sponsor of the program. Bill, thank you for being with us today, and I really am interested in listening to your story. I think in our premiere we've had an opportunity to listen to a few things that will be very interesting. But we'd like for you to start right at the beginning, where you were born, something about your mother and dad, about your family, anybody who's in the military that you want to talk about, and then your schooling quickly through that, and then into your story about the service. Did you start?
Okay, very good.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for having me here. I appreciate being able to have the opportunity to tell my story. Yes, I was born in Evergreen Park, which is part of Chicago, Illinois. I grew up until the age of about 5 or 6, and pretty much Chicago had a lot of different neighborhoods. And the neighborhood that we lived in, you were either Polish, Hungarian, Czech, or German. And everything was centered around that culture. Now, the French had theirs, the Irish had theirs, everybody had their own neighborhoods. And you didn't come into our neighborhood and cause trouble because we had tough guys. Every neighborhood had their tough guys to take care of business. But in our neighborhood, the butcher was Spitz. That was German. So it had the sawdust on the floor and all the things that the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Polish would eat. Most of those people were brought to Chicago because they worked in the meat industry. As you know, Chicago was a big processor of meat. The cattle would come in, they'd cut up the steaks, they'd make the sausage and the hot dogs and all that. And these were basically people from Eastern Europe that were farmers but knew how to butcher animals. And so this is why they got those jobs. You didn't particularly need to speak too much English at that time. And in a lot of these neighborhoods, the newspaper was still in the old languages. And I can remember at the age of probably 5 or so, we lived in like the old brown brick buildings that probably had maybe between 4 and 5 flats. And during the summertime in particular, a peddler would come through and he'd have this cart-drawn wagon with horses. And of course I'd run down to see the horses and so forth. And you never forget the smell of not only the horses, but also all the vegetables and fruits that he'd bring along. He'd come along, I think, about every day and bring that through there. Now, we were living in the Polish neighborhood. This was an area called 19th Street, and it was really about where most of the second generation Polish people actually lived. There's a primary place in an inner part of Chicago, and that's when they first come to the country. And once they do a little bit better with their jobs, then they can move into this area and then buy a house and a business. And like normally you'd see a lot of these row houses, and on every corner there was like a church, usually a Catholic church, on the other corner a Catholic school, a bar and a restaurant combined on the other corner, and then a grocery store, a corner store, and this is how pretty much most of the neighborhoods were set up. Everything was right there. Probably about the age of 5 or 6, my father had been working for, at the time it was called International Harvester. Today there's a Navistar plant over in Springfield. They make the big trucks. Back then they did farm machinery, the farm tractors. I think it's IH Case now, but that's what they did back then. But he was mainly into the trucks. And he worked at a place where they sold and serviced trucks out on Roosevelt Road. And the top people that ran International Harvester in downtown Chicago at the time knew him because he was very personable, and all the customers seemed to like him. He was really friendly. Of course, living in those old neighborhoods, you either knew how to talk a lot and be real friendly, or you knew how to run, or you knew how to fight. One of those three things, and I'm not sure which order it came first. I think his brother Ed was one of the toughs. He did more fighting than he did talking, but my father wasn't that way. He was more sociable and so forth. As a matter of fact, he claims that his gang, they were probably some of the first wedding crashers. They didn't have too much money back in, this was the Depression time. There wasn't a lot of money, so the gang would get together, everybody'd come up with a quarter or something, somebody had a car, they'd buy the gas, they'd find out where the weddings were, and they'd go out to these weddings. They didn't know a soul, they didn't know anybody there, but they wanted to get to the free beer, and they knew there was good food and beer there. And so they got to dance, you know, it was free entertainment and so forth. But anyway, we moved out of that neighborhood, and my dad had a pretty good job. He was in charge of repairing all these trucks and the sales of the trucks and so forth. I know one experience, I know it was about 5 or 6 years old, one of his better customers wanted to buy a brand new, he had a lot of dump trucks and cement trucks, and he had the money to buy brand new, so he got my dad to take him to, I want to say Fort Wayne, Indiana, to pick out a truck right off the assembly line, and he was going to get that truck. And so they woke me up. I was supposed to go along with them. It seemed like it was 4 o'clock in the morning. And I got in a Cadillac for the first time in my life that had air conditioning, and this had to be like, I don't know, maybe 1954, 56, I'm not sure what. But it was an experience to see air conditioning come out of a car, you know, brand new car. Traveled all the way there, picked up the truck, and then I think I drove back with my father. He drove the truck back. But that's the kind of, you know, relationship he had with customers, and the front office there in Chicago knew it. So they asked him if he'd be interested in doing foreign service for him. So he talked to my mother about it, and they were given two options. He could either go to Buenos Aires or he could go to Mexico. My mother thought about it for a while, and she said, God, Buenos Aires, that'd be like 3 days away, you know, by airplane then. I mean, DC-6 was about what you had, you know. So she said, well, we'll take Mexico, because the pay was going to be about 5 times what you could make in the United States if you worked for them abroad in foreign service. So he took that job. He went from being in charge of like 50 men to being in charge of 6,000 Mexicans that only spoke Spanish. So he took that job. But after we lived on 19th Street till I was about 5, we moved out to Lombard, which is probably kind of like a suburb of Chicago. They built a new house, just got the new house built and everything the way they wanted, and then this foreign service job came up, and they said, okay, we've got to take it, and they did it. And we were still young. I was like 5 or 6. I think my older sister was a year older than myself, and I had a brother who was 5 years younger, and my youngest sister was on the way. So it was kind of an adventure, and like I said, it kind of made my day. I mean, my first experience in even seeing any doctors that I can remember was my sister had rheumatic fever, and a doctor shows up in a brand new Cadillac at her house, comes in, sees my sister, examines her and so forth, and tells my mother, well, put her on these antibiotics and this will take care of her, and that was it, you know. Then my next experience with the doctor was, like I said, we had a passport, and I had to go to the company doctor because we were going to a foreign country, and I got all my shots, and these people were real nice. They're walking around in ties, white coats, and all this kind of, nurses were real nice. I said, boy, this looks like pretty nice work. You know, you don't get dirty or anything like that. So that kind of probably was the start when I thought, well, maybe I should go into medicine or something like that. So anyway, getting back to the family part of it in there in Chicago, at that time, just about everybody of our family that we knew probably lived within a 25-mile radius of where we lived. But things were starting to expand because we were moving to Mexico. But at that time, everybody we knew, all my uncles and aunts and cousins and everybody lived right there in Chicago. On my mother's side, going back to her father, his name was Ludwig Bogash, and he was of Polish-American descent. He grew up in a tough neighborhood, and he was in the First World War. And because he was, I think, a platoon leader, when he came back, he got a postal job, a big postal job in Chicago, and he was in charge of a lot of people. A lot of them were Negroes. And it paid so well that he decided that when he retired from the post office, he want, you know, a lot of immigrants, they want to have their own business. And so he wanted to move out of Chicago, and he moved into Berwyn, Brookfield, around the Brookfield Zoo, and this is during the Depression. This building still exists. He had a building built so that it was a hardware store. And the hardware store, I can't tell you exactly how long it was, but it stretched almost half a block. And in the back of the block, I only remember being there a couple times, in the back of the block, that's where they lived. And they had these cups that looked like they were 4 times the size of normal, what a normal person would drink out of for coffee. But that was the European style cup. And they lived in the back and they took care of the store. And when they weren't, you know, he'd go to the job and then his wife would run the store. You know, they were just workaholics. There wasn't, TV was just coming out, so, you know, there wasn't much to do.
This is after you gave up, retired from the post office, you mean?
Oh, he was still working. He was
still
still
with the
working.
post office.
He's got his wife Rose. She was a painter, bohemian painter. That was his second wife. And 1/4 of the store had everything for painters, people that not painting houses, but painting artists. She was, yeah, that's what she was. So she'd run the store during the daytime. He'd come home from work. He'd have dinner, coffee. He'd run the store at night. This kind of, I mean, just workaholic type people. His father, before him, he immigrated here to the United States, and I think it was out of Vienna, Austria. And I'm not sure why it was out of Vienna, Austria, but you know, a lot of those European countries is like us driving down to Kentucky, you know, from here. But they were, from what I understand, Polish American, and that name Bogash, B-O-G-A-C-Z-Y, I think there's a Y on the end. I'm told from people that do the linear research, what it means in Polish is rich man. And so this is what my grandfather Ludwig, he was all about that. Matter of fact, my mother said when she was 5 years old, he always had a new car. And he took the whole family out to the Grand Canyon before there was a park. I mean, to drive out there during the middle of the Depression is just unbelievable. I mean, I've been out, still have family out there in Arizona, and I've been out to the Frank Lloyd Wright Museum out there northeast of Scottsdale, and I'm just totally impressed where he built that place out there in the 1930s out in the middle of nowhere when the town of Phoenix probably had 2 streets and they were dirt paved. You know, it was just out of nowhere. So I can't imagine anybody driving a car that far. You'd have to be a mechanic, you know. So that was her side of the family. On my father's side of the family, he also had a job. His father had a job. They had a farm west of Chicago, and his father drove a locomotive, plus owned this farm. And he was killed in an accident, and his wife was from a rich family, so she took the insurance money and decided she was going to go take the kids, go into Chicago and live it up. And so that's basically what she did. And so he wound up, he had lived on the farm, plowed with horses, worked with horses, and so then when World War I came along, he had that work experience, plus living in one of the neighborhoods, the tough neighborhoods. World War I came along, he wound up being, I think, like a platoon leader type thing. People got killed off, and all of a sudden you might have been a private or corporal, and all of a sudden you're leading things, you're running things. And when you came back from the service, these people, like my grandfather Ludwig and my father's father, George, when they came back, they usually got pretty good jobs, usually in charge of other people, and that's what they were, like supervisors or something like that. So that was a good thing. I mean, they at least had jobs during the Depression, where a lot of people didn't. I mean, during the days of FDR, he tried to get work programs, get the country back on its feet. Some people would get on a train, maybe for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and go out and build some of our national parks, but it was temporary work. And then they'd come back and, you know, you have to wait until the next trip, you know, to get some money, whatever. My father, he was the real hero. I mean, I didn't shoot anybody. I was out to save people. But when my father went into actually went into the Army, and after Pearl Harbor, that's when most people went into the service. But you know, back in those days, just about everybody that I knew was trying to get into the service. He had a brother, his younger brother, Ray. He had one foot that was shorter than the other. And he tried to get into the service 3 different times. I said, well, your foot's too short, you know. Finally, he wouldn't stop. And so finally they let him in, and he became a mechanic. You know, he at least got in and got to serve his part. On my current wife's side, her father was from Kentucky, and he was tall and thin. He tried 3 times to get into the service, and they said, well, he didn't weigh enough. He wound up working, I don't know, maybe 40 or 50 years done it right pat as a civilian. So, I mean, like, people back in those days, they were anxious to get any kind of a job. And, of course, you got into the military back then, you got a new suit, 3 meals a day, maybe some extras, you know. So that was a big deal. Unfortunately, we got into World War II. We didn't have any kind of a military machine, no military hardware. The only reason we did as well as we did was because FDR was part of the 10% of the filthy rich of this country. He knew how to talk to them, and he told them, now, you listen here, if you put your money up into our factories and we start building the military machinery to win this war against the Nazis and the Japs that destroyed Pearl Harbor, you're going to make a lot of extra money. And that's the part, the extra money is what got our military machine going here in this country, and it's still going. And so when my father went in, it was the Army Air Corps, and then later it became the Air Force after he'd left. But he went in, and before he got in, after he finished high school, and I guess he was a pretty good student, you know, took the typing, took all these courses and stuff like that, college prep, because his older brother did. And then his friends, they were trying to get into taking some little part-time jobs and trying to get into college, I think they went to University of Chicago, Illinois, and his friend said, you know, you got a really good voice. You ought to go into like be an announcer on radio or something like that. So he said, okay, I'll take a few courses in radio. Well, when he got into the Army, he told him he'd taken some courses in radio, and he said, well, you'd be a radio operator on a B-25 or a B-29, so that's what he was. And he was thinking, okay, it's going to be like doing a radio show. Well, he gets in there, and of course, back in those days, we didn't have text and email like we do today. He writes my mother at that time and says, yeah, I'm a radio man, all right, but I only do the radio when I'm not running the 50 caliber machine gun. He said, I mean, when we're under fire, everybody's a machine gunner. And she writes back to him and says, you know, that's dangerous work. Can't you get a safer job? And so he says, well, I'll keep that in mind. And he was out in the South Pacific and chasing the Japs. And something came up where they were looking for radio people with his training. He knew about radios, he knew how to building the antennas for them, and they were looking for somebody to be on the ground. And he didn't know anything about it, but he says, okay, I'll volunteer for that. It sounds safer than being up in the airplanes, you know. So he takes the job, and he winds up with some Philippine militia. They knew the jungles. They knew how to find the Japanese. He just tagged along, and he was going to set up the antennas, and he was going to call it. He was a spotter. He never said he was a spotter, but that's what he was really doing. I talked to a guy when I worked at the hospital up in Sydney. He was in Vietnam. He was a spotter. He says, I had a Sicilian guy, a Navy SEAL, protecting me all the time, and others. And they'd take me in places. I'd call in the shots, and then he'd get me the hell out of there. He was a killer by birth. He said, I was lucky to have him because he was in some tough spots. But these guerrillas took my father into the jungle. My father says I weighed 190 pounds of just pure muscle when I went into the jungles. When I came out, I was lucky if I weighed 130 pounds. He said, once my K rations were gone, I had to eat what they ate. They ate rice, stuff from the jungle. They even ate monkeys. And he said, they didn't really get the shots that people do today. I can remember when I was in the service, we walked single line, and there were medics on both sides shooting us with guns because we were probably going to Vietnam, or so we thought. Well, in my case, I didn't go, but everybody was shot for that purpose. And so in the jungle, he must have had yellow fever, amoebic dysentery, and everything else, and that's why he lost all that weight. Fortunately, when he got to Manila, he said he ran to his brothers, and they were driving the trucks with all the food. So he was able to eat a lot of steak and ice cream and put the weight back on. But that's what he was doing. We didn't really have anything like Navy SEALs or any of the Green Berets or the Special Forces back then. We had Canadian British forces training us to do that. Now, I think what he said, what came in was he'd call in the shots, they'd drop the bombs on the Japanese locations, or the ships would shell them. And then they had a group, I think they were trained by Canadians and British commandos, and they were called raiders, and they'd come in and mop up, clean up behind that. But his mission with these guerrillas was just to seek and find these people and call in the shots, not to engage them. But, you know, just sometimes it happened, you know. So that's what he did. And so, and all of my uncles, they were all in the military during the war. I mean, like I said, whatever you could get in, the Army. I had one uncle who was in the Marines. I mean, he was like 40 years old and still jumping around like a kid, you know. Just happened to be a Marine. But my other uncles, I mean, they were in during World War II. They did their duty and so forth, and then they got out and got jobs. my father, his experience, and he never really talked about what he did or that much about it. But when we were down in Mexico, this was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I didn't know much about what he did. All I know is that when things started to heat up, suddenly we had a shortwave Hellcraft radio, and I was, excuse me, I was helping him set up some kind of a four-way Marconi antenna on the roof. He might have worked foreign service for this country, but for that company, but he might have been doing something else. Because shortly after that, I had never seen any Mexican Air Force planes before. They had our old junkers. They had the DC-3s fixed up like boxcars. And they, probably about 4 weeks before the Russians blinked, they covered our area where we lived. And we're looking for to clear the space. And 4 weeks after that, and I knew that there were bases, air bases, Air Force and Navy in Texas, because we went to the border every now and then, and we lived there. The day that the Russians blinked, 4 squadrons of jets came in at 300 feet. I'm a pilot, I know. They came in low to the ground, and the pilots, I could actually see their helmets and what was on their planes. We lived on a plateau almost a mile high, surrounded by mountains. They came in low, and when they reached our point, they turned 90 degrees and headed to the Gulf, and it was probably 150 nautical miles to Cuba, and it was do or die. That's when the Russians backed down.
So these are Mexican pilots?
No. These are American pilots.
American pilots, okay.
The Mexicans cleared the area,
I see.
the airspace. And they came in like right on top of our house.
Sure. Well, how long were you in Mexico, and then you came back and...
We were there about 7 or 8 years,
Okay.
but during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And then you came back to the United States, and you were finishing school in the United States, and...
We were there 7 or 8 years. At the end of that tour, we were asked to go to Heidelberg, Germany, but Mother said no. She'd been away too long. But what happened with me was, when I first got down there to Mexico, the whole family wanted to be, well, when you're in Rome, live like the Romans, okay? And so we tried to do everything Mexican, learn Spanish and all this. So the company that my dad worked for, they said, well, okay, we know somebody that speaks English that could teach the family Spanish. So he said, great, what do we do? And so they sent a lady over. She comes to the house, brings a loaf of bread, and she says, "Buenas noches." And hey, that was big for us, you know. That meant good evening. So we have her come in. She's teaching us Spanish.